Think the Wild West was all gunfights and gold rushes? The truth was way harsher, and it started the day you were born. Most people never made it past childhood, and if you did, life meant backbreaking work, constant danger, and a death that came way earlier than anything we'd consider normal today. This wasn't about becoming a legendary gunslinger. It was about surviving long enough to see your next birthday. And it all began in the worst way possible, being born on the frontier. The mortality rate was staggering. 1 in 5 babies died before their first birthday. Mothers died in childbirth so often that it was considered a normal risk of being a woman. Infection, hemorrhaging, and complications that would be minor today killed thousands. Midwives were the only medical help available, and their knowledge was hit or miss. Some were experienced and skilled, others were just the nearest woman who'd helped with births before. You got whoever was available, and you hoped for the best. Labor could last for days with no pain relief except maybe whiskey or laudanum. Women would bite down on leather straps, scream into pillows, and endure agony that modern medicine has made almost obsolete. The pain was just the beginning of the ordeal. Breech births, twins, and other complications often meant death for mother, baby, or both. There were no emergency C-sections. If the baby couldn't be delivered naturally, midwives would try to turn it manually or use forceps. These interventions often caused more harm than good. Infection after birth killed more mothers than the delivery itself. With no understanding of germs or sterilization, women would develop childbed fever from bacteria introduced during delivery. They'd die slowly over days, delirious with fever, while their families watched helplessly. Babies born premature had almost no chance of survival. There were no incubators or specialized care. A premature baby would be wrapped in blankets near the fire and hope to survive. Most didn't make it through the first night. The umbilical cord was cut with whatever knife or scissors were available, rarely sterilized. This introduced infection directly into the newborn. Tetanus from contaminated cutting tools killed babies within days of birth. If you survived being born, your first years were a gauntlet of diseases, accidents, and dangers that killed children at shocking rates. Infancy on the frontier was a constant battle against death. Babies faced threats from every direction, and parents could do almost nothing to protect them. The first 2 years were the most dangerous of your entire life. Diarrheal diseases killed more babies than anything else. Contaminated water, spoiled milk, and poor sanitation meant babies were constantly sick. Dehydration would kill them within days, and there was no treatment except hoping they could keep fluids down. Whooping cough swept through frontier communities regularly. Babies would cough so violently they'd turn blue and stop breathing. Parents would watch their infants suffocate, unable to do anything. The disease killed up to half the babies who contracted it. Measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria were death sentences for infants. These diseases spread rapidly in close quarters. One sick child would infect an entire family. Parents would bury multiple children within weeks of each other. Malnutrition was common even in families with enough food. Babies were weaned early because mothers were pregnant again or needed to work. Cow's milk and solid foods introduced too early caused digestive problems that led to failure to thrive. Accidents killed babies constantly. They'd roll off beds onto hard floors, crawl into fires, or be stepped on by livestock. Frontier homes weren't child-proofed because that concept didn't exist. Babies were just expected to survive in dangerous environments. Exposure to extreme temperatures killed infants regularly. Cabins were freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. Babies couldn't regulate their body temperature effectively. They die from hypothermia or heat stroke while their parents slept nearby. Sudden infant death was common and unexplained. Babies would be fine one moment and dead the next. Parents would wake up to find their infant had stopped breathing during the night. There was no understanding of SIDS or safe sleep practices. The few babies who survived infancy entered childhood facing a whole new set of dangers that would kill many before they reached 10 years old. Childhood on the frontier meant work, not play. By age 5, children were expected to contribute to family survival. There was no concept of letting kids be kids. You worked or the family suffered. Boys would help with livestock, chop wood, and do heavy labor that would be considered child abuse today. 5-year-olds would be sent to fetch water from wells or streams, risking drowning or getting lost. 7-year-olds would handle axes and other dangerous tools. Girls would cook, clean, and care for younger siblings. They'd work over hot stoves and open fires, suffering burns regularly. They'd carry heavy loads of water and laundry. The work was endless and exhausting for small bodies. Education was rare and brief. Most frontier children never attended school. Those who did might go for a few months in winter when farm work was lighter. They'd learn basic reading and math if they were lucky, then return to full-time labor. One-room schoolhouses served all ages together. A single teacher would try to educate children ranging from 6 to 16. The older kids often bullied younger ones. Teachers maintained discipline through corporal punishment that was brutal even by frontier standards. Books were scarce and expensive. Most families owned only a Bible, if they owned any books at all. Children would share slates and chalk, learning to write by copying letters over and over. Education was a luxury most families couldn't afford. Play happened in brief moments between work. Children would make toys from scraps, play with animals, or invent games that cost nothing. But leisure time was minimal. Most of childhood was spent working alongside adults. The dangers of childhood were constant and deadly. Children would drown in rivers and wells. They'd be kicked by horses or trampled by cattle. They'd fall from heights, get lost in wilderness, or be attacked by wild animals. Accidents with tools and machinery killed children regularly. A boy using an axe would miss and hit his leg, bleeding to death before help arrived. A girl's dress would catch fire from the cooking stove, and she'd burn to death while her family tried to save her. Kidnapping by hostile groups was a real fear. Children playing near settlements could be taken. Some were never seen again. Others were recovered years later, having forgotten their original families entirely. Disease continued to kill children throughout their youth. Scarlet fever, typhoid, and tuberculosis swept through communities. Families would lose multiple children in single epidemics. Graveyards were full of small headstones marking short lives. Those who survived childhood entered adolescence facing adult responsibilities while still being physically immature. Teenage years on the frontier didn't exist as a distinct life stage. By 13 or 14, you were considered an adult with adult responsibilities. Childhood ended abruptly, and you were expected to contribute fully to survival. Boys at 14 would do the same work as grown men. They'd break horses, drive cattle, and handle firearms. The physical demands were enormous for bodies that weren't fully developed. Injuries from this premature hard labor would affect them for life. Girls at 14 were often married or engaged. They'd be running households, cooking for large families, and sometimes pregnant with their first child. The physical and emotional toll was severe. They were children forced to be adults. Apprenticeships started young for those learning trades. A boy might be sent to work for a blacksmith or carpenter at 12 or 13. The work was dangerous, the hours were long, and the pay was minimal or non-existent. But it was better than having no skills at all. Coming of age meant different things for boys and girls. Boys proved themselves through physical feats, hunting success, or fighting ability. Girls proved themselves through domestic skills and marriageability. Both genders faced intense pressure to meet these expectations. The transition to adulthood was marked by taking on debt, getting married, or leaving home to seek fortune. There were no graduation ceremonies or celebrations. You just started doing adult work and were expected to succeed. Young men would leave home to work cattle drives, mine for gold, or homestead their own land. Many died in these pursuits. The ones who survived would return years later, aged beyond their years by hard living. Young women had fewer options. Marriage was the expected path. Those who didn't marry faced social stigma and limited economic opportunities. Some became teachers or seamstresses. Others had no choice but to work in saloons or worse. The early 20s were when people were at their physical peak, but frontier life was already breaking them down. Years of hard work, poor nutrition, and constant stress took their toll early. Marriage happened young by modern standards. Girls married at 15 or 16, boys married at 18 or 20. These weren't romantic partnerships, they were economic arrangements necessary for survival. Courtship was brief and practical. A young man would ask a girl's father for permission to marry. If approved, they'd marry within weeks or months. Love might develop later, but it wasn't the primary consideration. You married someone who could work and produce children. Wedding ceremonies were simple affairs. A traveling preacher might perform the service, or a justice of the peace. Some couples just declared themselves married without any official ceremony. The legal niceties mattered less than the practical arrangement. Honeymoons didn't exist. Couples would marry and immediately start their life together, usually in primitive conditions. A newlywed couple might live in a one-room cabin, a tent, or even a dugout carved into a hillside. Pregnancy followed marriage quickly. Women would be pregnant within months and would continue having children every 2 years until they died or reached menopause. 10 to 15 pregnancies over a lifetime was normal. The physical toll of constant pregnancy destroyed women's health. Their bodies never recovered between births. Malnutrition, anemia, and exhaustion were constant. Many women looked elderly by their 30s from the strain of continuous childbearing. Infant and child mortality meant that having 10 children might result in only 5 reaching adulthood. Parents would name new babies after dead siblings. The emotional toll of losing child after child was devastating, but it was so common that people were expected to just accept it and move on. Young families struggled to establish themselves economically. Homesteading required years of backbreaking work before the land produced anything. Mining was a gamble that rarely paid off. Most young families lived in poverty, working constantly just to survive. The prime working years from the mid-20s to early 40s were when people accomplished the most, but also when their bodies began to break down from the relentless demands. Men in their 30s were doing the hardest physical labor of their lives while their bodies were already damaged from years of abuse. Broken bones that healed wrong, chronic pain from injuries, and developing arthritis made every day a struggle. Back problems were universal among frontier men. Lifting, digging, and heavy labor destroyed spines. Men would be bent and hobbling by 40, looking like they were 70. There was no treatment except continuing to work through the pain. Women in their 30s were worn out from constant pregnancy and childcare. Their teeth would be rotting or gone from calcium depletion. Their hair would be thinning. Their bodies would be permanently damaged from multiple difficult births. Chronic health problems developed that would never be treated. Hernias, prolapses, and other conditions that modern medicine fixes easily were just endured. People lived with constant pain and disability because there was no alternative. The accumulation of injuries meant most people were partially disabled by their late 30s. Missing fingers from accidents, permanent limps from broken bones, and scarred bodies from burns and cuts were normal. Everyone was damaged in some way. Mental health deteriorated along with physical health. The constant stress, loss of children, and brutal living conditions caused depression and anxiety that had no treatment. Some people just broke mentally and were considered touched or simple. Alcoholism was epidemic among frontier men. Whiskey was cheap and available, and it temporarily dulled the pain of existence. Many men drank themselves to death, leaving widows and orphans to fend for themselves. Social standing peaked during these years for those who succeeded. Successful ranchers, businessmen, and professionals gained respect and influence, but success was rare. Most people just survived, never getting ahead. The 40s were when people started to be considered old. By modern standards, they were middle-aged. By frontier standards, they were approaching the end of their useful lives. Men in their 40s looked ancient. Sun damage, hard living, and poor nutrition aged skin dramatically. A 45-year-old frontiersman would look 65 today. The weathered, leathery appearance was universal among outdoor workers. Women in their 40s were often done having children, either through menopause or death. If they'd survived their childbearing years, they might live longer, but many died in their 40s from complications of their last pregnancy or from sheer exhaustion. Chronic diseases that developed earlier would worsen. Tuberculosis, heart problems, and untreated infections would slowly kill people. The decline was gradual but inevitable. You'd watch yourself deteriorate with no hope of improvement. Teeth were mostly gone by the 40s. Dental care didn't exist beyond pulling rotten teeth with pliers. Most people were toothless, making eating difficult and contributing to malnutrition. Dentures were expensive luxuries few could afford. Vision problems made work difficult. There were no eye exams or corrective lenses for most people. You just struggle to see, making accidents more likely. Blindness from untreated conditions was common. Hearing loss from years of gunfire, loud machinery, and untreated infections left many people partially deaf. Communication became difficult. Isolation increased as people couldn't participate in conversations. The ability to work decreased as bodies failed. Men who'd done heavy labor their whole lives could no longer lift or dig. Women who'd worked constantly found themselves too weak to continue. Becoming unable to work meant becoming a burden on family. Very few people reached their 50s, and those who did were considered remarkably old. Making it to 60 was rare enough to be noteworthy. These elderly survivors were respected but also pitied for their suffering. Old age on the frontier meant complete dependence on family. There were no pensions, no retirement savings, no social safety nets. If your children didn't care for you, you'd die alone and destitute. The elderly were often in constant pain from arthritis, old injuries, and chronic conditions. They'd spend their days sitting, unable to do much beyond light tasks. The vibrant, active elderly people we see today didn't exist on the frontier. Mental decline was common and untreated. Dementia and confusion were just accepted as part of aging. Families would care for elderly relatives who no longer recognized them, adding to the burden of frontier life. Some elderly people were valued for their knowledge and experience. They'd advise younger generations, tell stories, and help with childcare. But many were seen as burdens, consuming resources without contributing. The very old were rare curiosities. Someone who reached 70 was remarkable. They'd survived diseases, accidents, and hardships that killed most of their generation. But survival came at the cost of a body that was completely broken down. Death could come at any moment from any cause. A simple fall could be fatal. A minor infection could turn deadly. The elderly lived knowing each day might be their last. When death finally came, it was often a relief. The suffering would end. The burden on the family would lift. Frontier life was so hard that death was sometimes welcomed rather than feared. The end came in many ways, but it always came early by modern standards. Death on the frontier was common, sudden, and often violent. The average life expectancy was around 40 years. Many didn't make it that long. The causes of death would shock modern people. Accidents killed more people than anything else. Falls from horses, wagon accidents, drownings, and workplace injuries were daily occurrences. One moment of carelessness could be fatal, and there was no emergency medical care to save you. Infections from minor wounds killed thousands. A small cut would become infected, spread through the bloodstream, and kill you within days. There were no antibiotics. You'd develop a fever, become delirious, and die while your family watched helplessly. Diseases swept through communities regularly. Cholera, typhoid, and influenza would kill dozens in a single outbreak. Entire families would be wiped out within weeks. The bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried. Childbirth killed women throughout their reproductive years. A woman might survive 9 births and die on the 10th. The cumulative damage and the risks of each pregnancy meant that having children was playing Russian roulette with your life. Violence claimed many lives. Gunfights, brawls, and murders were common. Arguments over land, water, or personal insults would escalate to deadly force. The lack of effective law enforcement meant violence was often the final arbiter of disputes. Suicide rates were high, though rarely discussed. The isolation, hardship, and loss drove people to take their own lives. Men would shoot themselves, women would take poison. The despair of frontier life was sometimes too much to bear. When someone died, Burial happened quickly. Bodies decomposed rapidly in heat, and there was no embalming. You'd be buried within 24 hours, often in a simple wooden box or just wrapped in a blanket. Funeral services were brief if they happened at all. A traveling preacher might say a few words. More often, family would just gather at the grave, say goodbye, and get back to work. Grief was a luxury people couldn't afford. Graveyards filled up quickly in frontier towns. Wooden markers would rot and disappear within years. Most graves became unmarked and forgotten. Your existence would be erased as if you'd never lived. Children's graves outnumbered adult graves in every frontier cemetery. The tiny headstones marked lives that lasted days, weeks, or a few years. Some families had entire sections dedicated to their lost children. Paupers' graves held those who died alone or broke. They'd be buried in unmarked plots, sometimes multiple bodies to a grave. No one would remember them or visit their graves. The wealthy might have elaborate headstones shipped from back east. These monuments stood out among the simple wooden crosses. Even in death, class distinctions were obvious. Some people were never buried properly. They'd die on the trail and be buried where they fell. Others would die in remote areas and never be found. Their bones would bleach in the sun, eventually scattered by animals and weather. So there you have it. Life in the Wild West from birth to death was a brutal struggle that most people lost early. No modern medicine, no safety nets, no guarantee you'd see tomorrow. Just constant work, endless danger, and an early grave that was probably unmarked and forgotten within a generation. Makes you appreciate modern healthcare, doesn't it? Those frontier people would be amazed by our complaints about life expectancy and quality of life. They'd probably laugh at us for thinking we have it hard when we live in climate-controlled homes with access to medicine that would have seemed like magic to them. The Wild West wasn't romantic or adventurous for the people who lived it. It was just a hard, short life that ended too soon for almost everyone.